This is Sam Stone with another installment of Dynamic Duos, the official CBR podcast. This week I'm here with Dave Maass and Patrick Lay, and we're talking about their upcoming original graphic novel, Death Strikes, The Emperor of Atlantis, out in bookstores on January 23rd and in comic shops on January 24th, published by Dark Horse Comics through the Burger Books line. Guys, thanks for sitting down and talking with me this afternoon.
Well, I'm just going to start with hello. Patrick, what's your version?
Hello.
Hello.
You got to. We're talking an opera book, so we got to do that opera intro.
I should have taken a Ricola before we got into it.
Sam, you want to take a shot? Can you do hello? Oh, yours is the best.
Yes. Yes.
So the reason
I love it.
It's amazing. So the reason we started like that is that is the start of the opera Der Kaiser von Atlantis. It is also the start of our adaptation of the book of the opera Der Kaiser von Atlantis, and our book is called Death Strikes, The Emperor of Atlantis. This hello is a theme. It's a motif throughout the book. Every conversation almost starts with this ridiculous hello, and it's really the sort of signature catchphrase. I'll just sort of go ahead and start and give you the overview of what this book is. So in 1943, there was a concentration camp in the Czech Republic, or Czechoslovakia back then, called Terezín, or in German, Theresienstadt. And this was the camp where the Nazis sent artists and intellectuals and composers and musicians, because they wanted to be this camp for show, to show the world that we're treating the Jews okay. They can make art here. They can make theater. They can, record music. But really, it was just a concentration camp like everything else. But there were these two creators, Peter Keen, who was a poet and an illustrator, and Victor Ullmann, who was an avant-garde composer, who got together to make this brilliant, satirical, science fiction, fantasy, zombie opera, really satirizing and lampooning authoritarianism and war in just this fascinating way. And so we've taken this opera and we've turned it into a graphic novel 80 years later. And that is where we are. Story-wise, it imagines a world where Atlantis never sank and instead became this superpower that declares war. Everyone, just war everywhere. And one day, the Emperor of Atlantis, who lives in this tower where he never interacts with anybody else except through this radio, declares all-out war, everyone against everyone. And at that point, the Grim Reaper, Death himself, says, I'm going on strike, creating a world of the living dead. And that's kind of where the story kicks off. Patrick, what did I miss in my introduction? I'm going to ask the first question there. What did I miss?
I think you hit it all. I mean, one of the interesting things about this project is not only is it a fascinating sort of sci-fi story by itself, it's interesting, it's wild, there's a bunch of genres represented, but it's also got this incredible backstory. The creators themselves, Peter Keen and Victor Ullmann, had fascinating lives, and the way that this opera was produced is so informative as to what the opera is about. So there's just a lot of layers that you can appreciate it on, certainly a lot of layers that brought us into the project.
Yeah, and I should note that sadly, neither of the creators survived to see it performed. So they wrote it in 1943, it was rehearsed in 43 and 44 in the camp, and then they were both sent to their deaths in Auschwitz. And this opera disappeared for decades and only reemerged in the 70s. It's been performed a handful of times, but this will be really the first attempt to bring this story to a mass audience outside of the very slim but respectable portion of the population that listens to German language modern operas.
With that in mind, how is it taking an opera and translating it into a graphic novel comic book format?
Oh, you're just jumping ahead in our questions, Sam. We've got a whole structure here.
I didn't know we were sticking to the stick script, man.
You know what? I think I'm gonna refine this one, because it is first of all, we'll say it's difficult, but it started in a lot of ways, Dave, if I'm not mistaken, with the research, with the opera itself. You did just a tremendous amount of research getting this project up and running before we even met. Can you kind of tell me about that research? Kind of walk me through. Was there a point where you thought, okay, I've done enough to get started, or I've done enough to move to the next phase? Like, what was that like when you were getting going?
Oh, all right. So I'm going to just sort of jump back a long ways back. So I discovered this opera, and I say discovered it because I found it on a shelf of a Best Buy in Phoenix, Arizona, back in the late 90s. This is not something I found on the internet. This is something that I just sort of happened upon by chance, looking around as a teenage mall rat for some punk rock, and just this collection called The Music Survives, with a cover, which I would later discover was designed by Art Spiegelman, of Maass fame. And I was just like, what is this? And I grabbed it and I looked at it, I brought it home, and I got very excited about it. I went and obtained the full opera, and I just became really, really obsessed with it, because this is not what you expect from an opera. You expect Vikings and horns, you expect, period pieces and things that last 6 hours with long intermissions.
Super convoluted love stories where this guy's killing this guy, but they're in love with those guys. Yeah.
Yeah. You don't expect something so modern, so contemporary, and so biting as this like science fiction fantasy story. And I think I always felt like it should be a graphic novel, that it really lent itself, the types of characters, the type of story, the conciseness of the opera. But beyond that, Peter Keene, the librettist, who was like in his early 20s at the time, was also an illustrator. Like, he drew, he wrote. He drew, he wrote. You'll see portraits of people, who lived on the concentration camp, and 9 out of 10 of times he was the one who drew. And, hundreds and hundreds of his paintings and illustrations survived, even though he didn't. And so I like to think that had he survived, had he gone on, he may have come to the US and found a career in comics, that this would have been a natural medium for him, and that maybe inside of his head as he was writing this, maybe there was the beginnings of something that would have maybe translated over to another medium. But yeah, I did do a tremendous amount of research for this. I always thought it was going to be a graphic novel. I think that there's an interview with me in the Phoenix New Times in 2001. There was a story about this coffee shop I hung out with, and there's a line about me talking about wanting to make this opera into a comic. And it just took me this long to really work on it, and that's just mostly because I hadn't met Patrick yet, and so it took a long time to really get the entire creative team together. That's not the truth. When we get to the question about that, maybe I'll delve into it a little bit more.
Well, I am curious. You said you were working on this in 2001, which I'll be honest, I didn't know. I knew that you had this.
I wouldn't say working. I wouldn't say working on it, unless you mean me sitting at a coffee shop going, "This would be really cool. I'm going to do this one day."
Thinking about it, doing the thought work,
thinking about it, getting deciding that in my life at some point, just maybe there was a bucket list that I wrote it on or something. I don't know. But it's been in my head for a very long time that this should be a comic.
So when did the title come up? When Death Strikes is the only part of the title that you kind of appended onto it. The Emperor of Atlantis is the English translation of Der Kaiser von Atlantis. When did the title come up?
Okay. So the opera is actually, called Der Kaiser von Atlantis. One of the documents calls it Der König von Atlantis, or the King of Atlantis. But it also has this subtitle that says Der Kaiser von Atlantis, or Death Abdicates, or Death, steps down. Death Abdicates. I don't know if anybody knows that word unless you've been watching The Crown, right? That the king abdicated in the first half of the 20th century. And I was like, abdicates, that's not going to work as a title. But Peter Keene actually did refer to the opera as Death Abdicates. He never had, Der Kaiser von Atlantis in his version of the libretto. And so I was thinking it through. This is actually a story about Death making a political decision, him stepping down to force, in protest of what has been decided. And because it was a lot of work for him and he didn't want to do it anymore and he thought it was just unfair. And so I was like, Death Strikes is what came to mind. Death going on strike, it goes with the wordplay that's throughout the graphic novel and throughout the opera, this double meaning of death going on strike, but Death coming back and striking down the Emperor of Atlantis. So it has this double meaning. And I thought it would work well with comic audiences. I think people are familiar with this kind of turn of phrase with Death. It made it for like a nice cover, and it also changed the focus. So when you say the Emperor of Atlantis, a lot of people, with the actual opera, think about the Emperor as the central character, and he's really not. It really is Death. Death is at least one of the main central characters in this, and I really wanted to focus on him. I would say that was an easy decision to make. The harder decision to make was trying to decide whether it was the Emperor of Atlantis or the Kaiser of Atlantis, because I had always thought of it as the Kaiser of Atlantis. But again, nobody knows what abdicates means. It's 2023. How many people know what a Kaiser is? Maybe people know what a Kaiser roll is. The Kaiser roll of Atlantis doesn't really work. And so even though my original inclination was to go with the Kaiser, we went with the Emperor of Atlantis because it made more sense.
And there's such a subtle distinction too between the Koenig, which is the king of Atlantis, the Emperor of Atlantis, to have two such very different connotations, right? Like an emperor leads an empire, right? An emperor is just that much more removed. An emperor might be the emperor over a king who's part of his empire, so you have to honor that as well.
Yeah. I mean, you guys had, one of the things, if we're sticking to script, is that you guys, how'd you guys get into comics? Like, how'd you guys form your partnership together and kind of come together over this mutual love of comics?
Oh, for the sake of editing, if you need to, I will also re-ask the question. Patrick, how did you get into comics?
How did I get into comics?
How did you get into comics?
So, I grew up primarily in the Midwest, right? The Great Lakes states. And where I'm from, there aren't a whole lot of art professionals. There aren't publishers around here for the most part. So growing up, comics were a thing that you read and they were things that you collected. They weren't things you made. And I got out of undergrad and I was an oil painter. And I was in this period of life where I was really floundering, trying to figure out why I was painting at all and if I had anything to say. And I came across this book called Genius by Christian and Siegel. Siegel and Christian, I guess, is the better credit. And it was, it was a comic about squandering your potential and being okay with not reaching the highest level. And it had a bunch of other things going on too. And I was looking at it and it was really speaking to me thematically. And I was looking at it and I was like, I could do this. Like I could draw these pages. These are not outside of my reach, and as an oil painter, I'd been trained to paint from life almost exclusively. That was my whole thing, was I paint what I see. And so inventing things out of my head was just totally alien to me. And so that's what I started doing. I started working with a friend who had this idea for a all ages kind of middle grade sci-fi adventure story. And we just started trying to make it. And it was just long enough ago that getting information on how to make comics, actually do it, was just it was still kind of hard. And so it was a lot of guesswork. We did 2 issues and partway through one of them, we went to a convention and I thought, oh, we're not doing this right. We're not doing this good enough. And I had to redraw that whole issue because I was like, this could be better. And then, it just kept getting better. So that's kind of how I started getting into it. It was really a kind of a hobby and a release valve for a lot of tension. And it turned into something that I could do and that I really loved doing, Dave, how did you get into comics?
Oh, okay. So I've always been a writer. You can go back and find a issue of National Geographic for kids with a review of some youth fiction book that I had read and enjoyed when I was 9 years old or something like that. I wrote for the local kids newspaper back then, and I wrote a lot of stories. But I think my first interaction with comics was around my bar mitzvah. Which obviously was around 13 there. My dad was in a Dungeons and Dragons club and invited all of his fellow D&D people. They didn't know that you're supposed to give a check for money to people for their bar mitzvah. That's what kids want, is a check that will go into their college fund or they can use to buy stuff. And instead, they all bought me a different volume of ElfQuest. And so...
Oh, wow.
I ended up with this huge stack of ElfQuest. And that was really my first interaction. And I would say that, like, just a sort of side note here, that one of the really gratifying things about this project that feels very full circle for me is that when I got to sign preview cards at San Diego Comic-Con at the Dark Horse booth, the Peonies were right after me. Like, they're on Dark Horse now too. And I was like, oh my gosh. Like, this is making 13-year-old version of me happy. This is making 20-year-old version of me happy. This is making 30-year-old version of me happy. This is amazing. But I didn't really do much with comics after that until my early 20s, when I started discovering literary comics. So, your Maass, a lot of the R. Crumb stuff, but then a lot of the more crossover Alan Moore, Neil Gaiman kind of stuff. And that really got me going and thinking more about all of the possibilities. Then later on, I was a reporter in San Diego for a while, which gave me the great opportunity of getting in to San Diego Comic-Con every year for free with the golden ticket that is the press badge. I'm sure Sam is familiar with how amazing this press badge is. It gets you into everything, never have to wait in a Hall H line ever. It's amazing. And so that just meant that every year for about a decade, I got to go and really see the full breadth of what is out there in the world, and from a very, different perspective than a lot of creators until now, where I'm getting to finally jump that fence. I'm enjoying being a comics creator now, but I do miss that golden ticket badge. Let me tell you.
Pretty sweet. Well, what about, what about Alaska Robotics Comics Camp?
That is where we met. So Patrick and I met in 2018 at Alaska Robotics Comic Camp. Patrick, can you explain to the audience what Alaska Robotics Comics Camp is? And I just want to apologize in advance to Pat Race for and Aaron at Alaska Robotics, who are going to get a flood of applications after we talk about this.
This
Patrick, what is Alaska
amazing.
Robotics?
It's so unique. So Alaska Robotics is an art gallery and comic shop in Juneau, Alaska. And it's run by those gentlemen, Pat and Aaron. And they'd been bringing friends up to Juneau in the comics community for years. Be like, you have to come to the city. It's beautiful. It's Alaska. It's amazing. And eventually they decided to formalize it. And it became this, what they call a mini convention. But it's similar to every small convention you're going to go to. And then, so everybody comes up for a convention. They run it for a day in Juneau. They also do dozens and dozens of school visits around the Juneau area. So like the whole city of Juneau just floods with comic creators on a Thursday and a Friday, and they just kind of disperse out into the community. And then there's a convention on Saturday, and then we all head out to a campground for the next 3 days. It's like 60 comic adjacent people, and it's at all levels. So when I went for the first time, I had just gotten an MFA in comics, but I was very much a fledgling creator, self-publishing everything, and nothing I did was all that good. And that same year, Molly Ostertag went, and I was like, do they think that that's the level that I'm on? Because they've made a mistake. They've made an error, and but no, they intentionally really mix it up. So I mean, you're rubbing shoulders with some of my absolute favorite comic creators of all time, like Jen Wang was there, Vera Brosgol, Ryan North, Tony Cliff, Raina Telgemeier, all go to Juneau for this show, and then you kind of go for this cool camp thing, and there are also some animators, comic journalists, it turns out, that were going. Dave, how did you find out about this camp? Because I was looking at Vera Brosgol, and I was like, oh, she's in Alaska, so I think I'm not trying to go. How'd you get there?
So my day job is at the nonprofit Electronic Frontier Foundation. So we're a civil liberties nonprofit based in San Francisco that fights for people's digital civil liberties as technology advances society. That's my little blurb about it. But we actually, as a entertainment company, still have a significant number of fanboys and fangirls and fan people out there. And so I was wandering around Comic-Con one year, and there was a dude, this redheaded, bearded dude at a booth wearing an EFF shirt, one of our classic ones too. And I was like, hey, you've got my shirt. And he's like, yeah. And it turned out it was Pat Race from Alaska Robotics. And he was just a huge fan, and he was a member of our organization. And I was like, we got to figure out a way to collaborate. We'll figure out something. Maybe you could do some graphics for us, for our anniversary. And so we exchanged contact details. And just by virtue of following him and being on the mailing list, I saw they were having this camp. And at this point, I really wanted to figure out how to do this comic. I had no idea where to start. And it sounded like this camp would be a good place to connect with artists who might be able to help, or at least give guidance on what to do. And then in exchange, I could, do a digital security training, like how to protect your privacy or talk about contemporary issues. And that would be my contribution back to the overall, experience. And I think I can remember very particularly where we met during that event, Patrick. I think it was maybe the last night we were there, and we were in the dark on the patio. I think you were drinking a bottle of beer or something. And I was like trying to figure out how much it would cost to get somebody to draw a couple of pages. And you were just like, maybe this much. And I was like, I can afford that. And, that was 2018. And that's how we met. But at that point, we weren't even discussing whether you would be involved in this at all. You were just some dude who was just like, I have a few minutes to describe this process and how much it would cost to do it.
Yeah, and I had just, like I said, gotten an MFA in comics, so I felt very educated. I was so qualified. But hearing the story of the opera, it really it just pinged off so many points, because I'm interested in history. And it was there, and I love genre work. I love comics, and it was there. And it's just such a unique, interesting thing. I was just so excited to see when you got a hold of me again in 2020. I was so excited that it was moving ahead. And I had all these people in mind who were like, oh man, this guy would be great for it. And what if this person did it? This is such a cool project.
Just to be pedantic, I'm going to just say it was 2019,
okay,
and I'll tell you what happened. So I'm going to be like, Patrick is asking me this question, Dave, what happened? How did you do? Blah blah blah. I'm going to answer that question that you didn't ask me in this dynamic duo interview. So in 2020, I was going to be taking a sabbatical from work. And so I was going to be able to take 3 months off paid. And I was like, I want to work on a project. And I was like, this is the graphic novel I'm going to work on. I'm going to dedicate that time to this. And I started writing up this proposal for it and a script, and I wasn't sure what to do next with it. And so I ended up messaging Derek Robertson from Transmetropolitan, the boys. We had communicated because he lives in Napa, and Transmetropolitan had been a huge influence on me, but also a huge influence on basically everybody who works at EFF. And I was trying to build connections. And I sent him my proposal, and he sent me some really great but tough feedback. And the number one piece of feedback he said is that you're not going to get anywhere unless you have an artist on board for this. Like, sometimes you can get by with just a script and a writer, but you need to go find an artist. And I had no idea how to find an artist. And somebody had recommended I try the website cartoonistofcolor.org.com, one of the two. One of those will work if you look at it online, and the other was queercartoonists, again, .com.org. I'm not going to Google it right now. But one of those two. And that's where I happened across this artist named Ezra Rose. Ezra is incredible. They are Jewish, they are trans, they are anti-fascist, and they are very into Jewish mysticism. And they had already drawn versions of skulls and, old radio objects, all these things that I was like, this has to go into our book. And contacted Ezra about the project, and Ezra was really interested, but Ezra said, I can draw some designs for you, I can draw some illustrations for you, but I am not the type of person who can generate 100 pages of sequential art. That is just not in my skill set. Would you be open to a collaboration? And I was like, okay, well, now I need to go find another artist to help with it. And I'm like, hey, guy that I met at Alaska Robotics on the patio and asked questions about this a year and a half ago, you got any ideas? And Patrick is like recommending this person and that person. He's given me this list of like 8 people, and I'm reaching out to them. And I was doing these paid tryouts where I would pay people to to draw a single page, and we would evaluate it. And eventually I was like, well, Patrick, why are you recommending like all of these other people and not like volunteering to try out yourself? I mean, I can pay you a little bit of money. What's the shot? And then Patrick was finally, sure, I'll do it. So Patrick, why is it that you didn't like recommend yourself just right off the bat? Why didn't you just save me the trouble of doing these tryouts and just volunteer?
Well, it's hard. Comics is relatively small, and I try to keep my friendly relationships friendly. And I felt like I knew a lot of people who really were phenomenal artists and would be so good for this project. I mean, that being said, once you'd sent me a script, I'd already picked out a page where I was like, I know what this one looks like. I already know what this one looks like. I would love to do this one. But, I wanted to check with this person and that person and this person before I, volunteered. If I ever volunteered, I'm not sure I would have if you didn't ask me. But I was really, really glad you did, because there was that one page and the approximate layout made it into the final book of Death kind of like racing across the spread on his white horse, collecting souls with elephants and ponies and tanks. And I was just sure that I knew already what this looked like. So I was really pleased that you asked me to do it. And I was even more pleased that you were like, yeah, let's do this together. Like, are you good to do this pitch? And I was like, yes, let's do the rest of it. Let's do it all.
So Patrick, in illustrating this, I gave you all these designs from Ezra. I gave you all this art from Peter Keane, and I said, you need to put this all into it. So what are the challenges of having Keane and Ezra's artwork that you have to base your illustrations on? And what are the advantages of having that kind of place to start?
So the biggest challenge is, the first one is just intimidation, right? Because, Keane was an incredible artist to begin with, and knowing that we're going to reference Keane's work, like knowing explicitly, you'd already picked out several panels where you were like, I'd like this to be in there. I'd like something like this to be in there. And knowing that we were going to reference that was just being intimidating. And Ezra's also phenomenal, right? So like, I know I can't match what Ezra does exactly. That's just, we're two different people. It was never gonna happen. So finding like my visual voice using those keys, that was interesting, and I've never done anything like that before. I've never worked off somebody else's character designs. So I had to like figure out what that meant and what it looked like. And it's hard enough when you're doing your own character designs. You draw the characters over and over and over, and eventually they come to look like themselves. And so you have to do the same process, but with something you didn't design. And I remember when we were doing some of the initial sketches, I had kind of like misunderstood what I was seeing. And there were parts where I had like just sort of assumed that like Life, for example, one of the characters, their skin was just like porcelain white, like they were like kind of otherworldly. And Ezra was like, no, they're wearing like like leggings thing, like these are torn off, and like they have just like regular skin. I was like, oh, like now that you say that, I can see it. So finding those little things, and then having the confidence to simplify in places where I knew I was going to be drawing this again and again, and I needed it to be like a little bit more simple than it had already been drawn. Without feeling like I've bailed on the character design. And really it's, the loudspeaker, which is a radio that threads throughout the entire book. That's the one where I really, really simplified the design, so that I could draw from different angles and not get caught up on it. So it was both things. It was really challenging, but it was also extremely helpful because I had things to go back on, and I think most of the characters, you draw them till you find them, and then some of the characters really became other people as I drew them. The Emperor is the number one. Is probably the most different from what Ezra handed me.
Which is
wearing the same outfit, but like older.
They've got the same outfit. They've got the same comb over. In the book, you'll see Ezra's design of the Emperor, and then it'll be slightly different than Patrick's. And one of my favorite parts of the process is when Patrick sends us all these sketches of his version of the Emperor, and there's one that he drew that he wrote is this too Brando? like it was like, this is old Brando. And it was like, because he thought it was too Marlon Brando. And it's funny enough, because that's the version that ultimately I think ended up developing in here, is a much more crotchety version, an older version than was originally imagined. But it works. It works. Yeah. Speaking of flesh or fleshlessness, Patrick, how glad are you that Ezra did not give Death feet, bony feet in this book that you don't have to draw over and over again?
And like, I love the way that, so the Death, the character, terminates at the ground in just a cloud of black smoke. I did not want to draw a bunch of bony feet. I would have drawn some boots, but that black smoke was such a useful device, because you could put character into it, you could put emotions into it. It could spike up when Death is angry. It can languish and get smaller when Death is, feeling low. It trailed behind him when he was active. He's riding a horse and stuff. So I was really, really pleased that was something we got to do. This whole book is in ink wash, and the ink wash that I approached it with was a little bit closer to like what you would do with watercolor. So it was a little bit more like doing a full watercolor book, just in monochrome. So I was very pleased that there weren't feet. It was hard to draw lots of bony hands. There's nothing keeping your thumb attached to your hand except for the flesh. So when you're trying to do dramatic hand poses, and that thumb's just like drifting off into space, you just hope that people will understand that you've done it justice.
So I would like to jump, because I know we've got to get through this podcast in under 4 hours, I think, for CBR. CBR said you can do this as long as you want, but I think 4 hours is probably too long for this. For those who are not able to see this visually, Sam kind of shook his head like, maybe it's okay to go 4 hours, if it's good enough. But I do want to jump ahead to what I think is one of the most exciting parts of this project that I don't think a lot of comics get to do, and that is we did field research on this. Yeah. Originally in 2020, I had planned this like intense trip that would have started in Amsterdam and gone through Poland and Czech Republic and Vienna and Switzerland and all over the place, any country where there was some sort of connection. And then, something happened in 2020 that just made me cancel the whole trip. It's not really worth going into. I mean, it was the pandemic, right? Like we had to cancel it, all my hotel plans, everything. Very well planned trip. I can send you my itinerary if you want, but it's a real bummer. But then, throughout 2020, we worked on this. Throughout 2021, we worked on this. And then in the beginning of 2022, we signed with Burger Books. And I was like, Patrick, pack your bag, buy your tickets. We are going to the Czech Republic. And so we went to Prague, and we went to Terezín, and, to gather information, to enrich our understanding, to talk to experts, but also to grab a lot of images that could make it into the book. And so, Patrick, how did visiting the Czech Republic, Prague, Terezín, how did that impact your process?
Well, one of the things that it did was really nail down the visual language of what Atlantis was going to look like, right? Terezín, I knew from the virtual tour that anybody can go do. If you go to the website, you can do a virtual tour and go through the streets, point by point, click your arrows like Google Street View. And I knew it had a lot of these very specific architectural details that were universal. Almost every building had them. So I knew that kind of thing I wanted to incorporate into the design of the city, but what I didn't, somehow I missed the strange shape of the city. The city started as this military fortification. So it has all of these pointed bulkheads, these star-shaped bulkheads that are meant to like resist invasion. And as soon as we started to see like these larger shapes and like be placed in that city, it was like, oh, this is the city. Like we're going to take this city and we're going to control T and we're going to scale that sucker out to the size of a full city. These walls, these points, these kind of like terracotta roofs, we're going to bring all of these elements in, and that's going to be sort of the basis of what Atlantis is going to be, so that when our characters are walking through Atlantis, in some ways they're also walking through Terrazine. And of course, we had to, sci-fi it up a little bit, because it's this like, it's in a world where Atlantis never sinks. So there's also contemporary towers and drones and things like that. But a lot of it will harken back to the architecture of Prague, the architecture of Terrazine itself. And if you're really familiar with Terrazine, you'll see places in Terrazine in the book. That was a huge part of, because at that point we were working on thumbnails, so some of those finer, grittier things hadn't been decided yet. So that trip really solidified those things. What were your impressions of Terrazine, Dave, while we were there?
Oh, this has been a place that's been in my imagination for decades, and I had just never had a chance to visit. And so it just blew my mind showing up, because, this is a town. I mean, it's essentially a town. It's like, imagine like a downtown small town that has a wall around it, and imagining thousands, way too many people than should be in there, imprisoned in here, trying to get, that make the most out of life through art and other creativity. But parts of it are so very well preserved. We got to go and, see the bunks where, Peter Keane and Ullman would have stayed. We got to see the archive there and dig around in these binders full of his artwork. One of my favorite details that made it into the book is that there's this scene with an executioner and a prisoner, and the executioner is unable to execute this prisoner as much as he tries. But the prison cell is actually modeled off of a prison cell at Terrazine that was, prior to World War II, was actually used to house and imprison the guy who shot Archduke Franz Ferdinand, kicking off World War I. And so these are just some of these like incredible details in there. The impressions, though, overall, I mean, it was very sad, but very fascinating. But then it's also just a really strange head trip, because, as I talk about in the essay in the back, like modernity is like flowing into this. So we are in the hotel, the one hotel in Terrazine. It's where we stayed the night. This is also where the Nazis lived, like the Nazi officers lived. It's now a hotel. And we're sitting there eating our Czech food, in the restaurant. And I'm like, oh my God, Patrick, look. And there is a cat robot, like one of these things that you see in Japan that just rolls out of nowhere to bring our beers to us. And I'm like, how did this robot make it to Terrazine? And there's also like an escape room there now. One of the biggest, I guess, appropriate or ironic, I don't know what the right word for it is that, as you probably know, Czech Republic is landlocked. So Terrazine never could have been sunk into the sea because there's no ocean there. And there's also at Terrazine a museum to Czech Republic's only pirate ship. And again, there is no ocean. So they somehow have this pirate ship because some Czech dude went off and became a pirate, and then these people brought this ship back to Terrazine, of all places. So it was really, really a weird, strange, but very moving experience. But so was Prague, because Peter Keane had also lived in Prague prior to being sent to Terrazine. He'd been an art student there, going to art school. He was thrown out of art school for being Jewish. Patrick and I tracked down the dormitory where he lived as a student, and it just happens to be a youth hostel and a dorm still. It's this huge thing. And we stayed there for many nights and ate food in the cafeteria. It was this... Patrick, can you explain what this facility looks like? Because it was really impactful on us.
It was such a strange experience, because we knew that it was where Peter Keane had lived while he was in Prague going to college, and but we still didn't know really what to expect. And when we got there and we realized that it was a dorm, and it was a lot like the dorm that I stayed in undergrad. It had these endless halls where all the rooms looked exactly the same. It was actually a maze. We kept getting kind of lost and turned around because there's
You
no
had to follow these
decoration.
colored lines on the ground
Yeah.
to find and like on the walls to find your room. And
Some of it's a dorm, but some of it's a hotel hostel situation. So it's like, well, don't go into the green section. That's still a dorm. Stay in the red section. That's the hostel. And we got to our rooms, and there were 2 twin beds and a little kitchenette. I mean, it was a dorm room. And when you were in the main, the foyer, wouldn't be a foyer, I guess, main entrance area, you could see on either side were these like lecture halls that had been used when it was a more active part of the university. And it was the most bizarre experience to stand on these steps that were made of marble with all of these architectural details still intact, with college kids around you, just getting ready to go out for the night. And really it hammered home for me that like Peter Keene was 25 when he was murdered in Auschwitz. I mean, at the time that he went to Terezin, he had just basically graduated college. Like, these were exactly Peter Keene's contemporaries right around the time that history started to unfold around him. And it really hammered home that like these were real people having a real experience, and that in many ways they were kind of unaware of the larger forces that were happening, and they were trying to make their lives meaningful. And in all these places where they could have chosen despair, instead they kept making things. And they made this opera in the worst possible circumstances to comment on their circumstances, even though they didn't really understand the full scope of what was happening around them. It was really affecting. It really it centers you in that history, and suddenly you see that like it becomes very clear and unavoidable that history is happening around us now. It really connected me, at least, to the book, like in that present moment. It was really interesting.
I had a sort of a similar experience, and I think you'd gone home by this point. But when I actually went to go visit the school where he went, there. I mean, this was at the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and so the art school was just covered in Ukrainian flags, and that really did give you this sense of history repeating, at the time.
Yeah, Dave, how do you feel about talking a little bit about putting the book together, working with Karen, and that process?
Sure. We found an agent in 2021, and we created a list of people that we were going to pitch this book to. I had interviewed Karen, like 2 or 3 years earlier when Nnedi Okorafor's LaGuardia came out. And at the time, Karen had really articulated how she saw the connection from Will Eisner's A Contract with God, and how that leads and is the same trajectory that leads to the science fiction LaGuardia book, and how these are both, one's a Jewish story, but they're both about immigrants. And so I was like, can we just throw Karen Berger on this list? And it was just like this long shot. And then sure enough, we heard from her saying, I want to publish this book. And it wasn't like, I want to talk to you more about this, or I have questions. It was straight up, I want to publish this book. And to be honest, I am not as into the world of comics to really fully know Karen's entire history. But Patrick, you were. And so what was your reaction? What was your reaction when I messaged you and I said, Karen Berger wants to publish this book? What was your reaction?
Well, I remember when we first put Berger Books on the list of people we were pitching to, because it's you never know, right? Like, you're gonna try and ask a lot of people a lot of questions, and you never know. And gosh, I'm pretty sure we had a conversation where we're like, well, if Karen Berger wants it, Karen Berger's gonna get it, right? Like, we're gonna give it to Karen Berger. I mean, Karen's name is on some of my favorite comics just of all time. And Vertigo, which is the imprint that she, was the founding editor of and the voice of, obviously kind of changed the comics industry in the United States fundamentally. Really changed the direction of what comics could do in sort of a serious artistic way. Especially in the direct market, as opposed to like the comics with an X, Robert Crumb kind of stuff. But she's also She edited my favorite run of Wonder Woman of all time, the George Perez, run of Wonder Woman, and like, so it was just absolutely phenomenal and mind blowing that we had a video meeting with Karen that I took at work for some reason, and the question was not, are we going to publish this book, but when are we going to publish this book? Like, what's the timeline? What's your process? And that conversation just absolutely blew my mind, shattered me to pieces. I was ecstatic. So Dave, I gotta know though, like, you've been a journalist for a long time, a writer forever, right? And obviously you've worked with editors, but working with an editor in this capacity is very different. Like, what was the experience of working with Karen? How was it different working in this kind of comics medium than what you were used to working in?
Well, the first thing is that in my career as a writer, I've never had somebody tell me to write more. Like, it's always like, this is 1,200 words. I asked for 700. Where can we cut 500 words? Karen was frequently asking us to add pages, to say like, hey, you've really truncated this scene into a single page, and this is going to work better if we break this out over 3 pages. She was like, you know what? This could use some more narrative. We could use some more dialogue. We really need to make this character fuller. And that was a new experience for me, having somebody encouraging me and giving me permission to really expand the writing and the storytelling here. And I think that this is one of the most important things I remember from this process, is that I think with some editors, they wouldn't really pay much attention other than copy editing and looking for red flags, and that's it, not really helping, impress more. There are other editors who would have looked at it and said, like, let's just stick to the script. Let's just stick verbatim to it. Let's just do a direct transcript of the opera and put art to it. What Karen really impressed upon me is that this is not an opera with illustrations. This is a graphic novel. This needs to work as a graphic novel. This needs to work as a story and be awesome. The best way to honor the people whose voices were silenced is to do the best graphic novel that you can do. And you don't have to stick to it. You don't have to be reverent to it. You don't have to go with it. You just have to make it good. And, and so that was really where, why I think the book is as strong as it is, because she really helped make sure and keep me on track. And whenever I felt like, oh, but, this was really important, she'd be like, is it important because to the storytelling, or is it just important because you're feeling like, you have to stick religiously to the text? On the whole, though, so throughout this process, I've tried to tell people, because you mentioned the Holocaust, you mentioned people are going to be like, think about Maass. Like, they're going to think about Maass. And I try to impress upon people that this is really less Art Spiegelman and more Neil Gaiman as a story. This involves death and satire and wordplay and fantasy. And so I don't want people thinking about it. And so really, though, I mean, if you're trying to go move towards a more Neil Gaiman approach, you really can't get a better editor than Karen Berger in that regard. Like, there's really no other name. You write a list, it's just one name, like other than maybe Neil Gaiman himself, but I don't think he has time to edit first time comic creators.
I think too, one of the things that really surprised me about the script when you first gave it to me, and I think one of the things that people will find surprising when they start reading the book, is that it's really funny. It's so funny. And even though Karen gave us permission to expand sequences and make it be the best story that it is, it's also extremely faithful in many ways to the opera, to the libretto. And some of those jokes, the best ones, the funniest ones, the darkest ones, came directly from the libretto. Like, Peter Keane was a wicked funny guy, and a lot of that ended up in the book, which I think is probably going to surprise people when they hear the backstory and they hear the themes, and then they crack it open and they're like, oh no, there's some good laughs in this. This is pretty funny.
Yeah. But, ultimately, though, the opera, we had 3 different texts, or original texts, that were contradictions from each other. Each was unfinished in some way. There was no canon to necessarily work off. So we did have to make a lot of choices, but we also had to fill in a lot of holes as well. I mean, it's an opera and it's poetic, so they can do things that don't necessarily make logical sense, but they're not going to work in a graphic novel. And so Karen really helped me figure out ways to bridge some of the holes, way to fill in stuff and to build upon the narrative. One of my, the interesting anecdotes from this is that I was always really confused why there's this character of a soldier in there. And, he's, throughout the book, he's there, representing, the soldier of conscience, in the opera, but he just disappears in the fourth act. He's just not there in the opera. And there's this big finale where everybody's there except for him. And I was like, where did he go? This is a huge plot hole. What happened to him? And it turns out that the reason he isn't there is because they didn't have enough actors. They didn't have enough singers to have the entire cast. So one dude was pulling double duty, and they just had to write the opera around it and just disappear him from the end. It's like, well, we can fix that. That's something that we can fix narratively. We can put him back in there. We can give this character closure that he didn't have in the original opera on a resource level. Not, now we have more resources. We can put him back in.
And to that point, so much of the opera, as far as what's described as the set, is really a black curtain. I mean, it's life and death, singing songs to each other and kind of joking around a bench.
Like a bench?
Yeah, like an empty stage.
There's a bench.
And then
the Emperor has a chair.
Yeah, with a weird radio thing, like a sci-fi radio thing. And but there's so much implication about what's happening in the world. There's so much, the songs are alluding to what their environment would be. And that's one of the things we got to play with is actually, visualize those things. There's a scene where life and death turn into salesmen, and they're trying to sell more days to people because days have just become so miserable. Nobody wants to live longer. They're trying to offload all the days they have. And we got to, visualize that. I mean, it's there in the opera. There's a song, they're bantering about it, but we got to, put little infomercial headsets on them and make it seem like they're trying to sell a sham wow. We got to play a lot of games that way that were really, really fun and really kind of filled out the world that the opera, they wrote to their limitations, like having the guy pull double duty. And they also didn't have much room in the way of props. I mean, what were they going to do? So they wrote to those limitations, and we got to kind of expand past that and visualize a lot of the things they implied, which is really great.
But it was also important to make sure that we maintain some of that as well. So the entire second chapter of the story is all set in one room, and it's in the Emperor's prison cell. And whereas we could have done jump cuts to the rest of Terrazine to build out this world, we're like, no, they did this brilliant thing where they built the world between a conversation between a dude and a radio. Let's stick with that. Let's make it visually interesting to be in this claustrophobic cell that makes people feel like the isolation, but still do that kind of world building, even though later in the book we will go to places that they couldn't have gone in the original opera.
I'm curious, through the... How have your thoughts on what the book should be changed since you first started thinking about it as a graphic novel back in, say 2001, and once we actually started actualizing it, putting it on pages and seeing things come out, did your thoughts on what it should be, how it should be, change?
So over the years, I've gone through sticking, very verbatim to the text to expanding it into an action film, sort of thing. I was let's do 10 comic series, and we'll add all this stuff, and we'll just very loosely stick to the original story. But as it came to actually putting it together, I was you know what, this is so good. Why veer that far from it? Let's stick to it. But then also being well, once I sat down and tried to do it verbatim, realizing, well, this is not going to work either. This is going to be, impenetrable to some people. I'm not sure if you've ever read like Art Spiegelman's adaptation of The Wild Party, this like poem about a really crazy party. And it's like a novel thing to read. But it is a little bit hard because it's all like old-timey 1920s language from it, and you're not necessarily getting that deep into it. And I also went and I reviewed some of Pete Craig Russell's adaptation of operas, which are very faithful. But I also, I very much respect Pete Craig Russell. He's great. But, I struggle a little bit with like The Magic Flute. And that's just because I'm not quite the opera fan that the book is really meant for. So that's the sort of thing that changed over time. I think one of the big things that did change was the dynamic of these two characters, the soldier and the worker in this book. These are like the two main human characters who are from opposite sides of this war and come to build a really human connection with each other once they realize they can't kill each other. And in the through trial and error, realize that they can't kill each other. Like, let's just put it like that. In the opera, this is like an old soldier and like a teenage girl, like in the original opera. And it really doesn't read well in 2023. It's a very like old-timey kind of relationship, especially with the violence involved and the power dynamics. And I was like, you know what? I want to update this. I want to stick. We didn't change much of the dialogue or like the structure of what happens in that scene, but we wanted these characters to have deeper backstories, to have more agency, and just be like not just archetypes and stand-ins for humanity, but actual people. And so, the soldier, pretty much the same. The main changes we made to him is that we made him a medic, not just a soldier, but an army medic. And I thought that really played to this irony of death and life throughout this. Like, I always feel like the idea of an army medic is like this, oxymoron, like somebody who's in a force that is designed to destroy, whose one job is not is to help people live. And so I wanted to maintain that irony. And then I wanted the other character to not be like some helpless farm girl, but to be like a worker, somebody who is, coming from a more hardened background and have a lot more, more aggression to them in a way. And then I was looking at like, well, what can I do with these two characters? Can I gender flip them? Can I make the soldier a female and the worker, a male? What could I do with it? And especially since I was thinking about this a lot because so many people who contributed to this project, who helped us and guide us, are either trans or non-binary people. And it was really important to me that this be a book that is not just like, straight heteronormative Jewish people look at it and see themselves in the book. I wanted other people to be able to see themselves in the book, particularly all these people who helped us and advised us and mentored on this. And so, I had some sensitivity readers and consultants that I was talking to about what can we do in this section? Like, how can we adjust this? And one of them suggested, like, hey, go take a look at this figure from the past named Magnus Hirschfeld, Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, who was a Jewish physician who was one of the leading specialists in what was not known then as like LGBTQ studies, but it was looking at I think he had coined the term transvestites, which you don't use anymore, but he was the one who had really started creating a body of work about gay people, trans people, and had built this huge library in Germany of all these science texts and analytical texts. And the Nazis destroyed it. Like, they totally destroyed it. And I was like, this fits well into this overall idea of this book, raising up censored voices. And particularly, here's a Jewish person whose voices were censored. We also live in a time where LGBTQ comics creators are seeing their works banned across the country. And, this book we're writing here could end up being banned across the country, by Moms for Liberty and other groups. And so I was like, this really makes sense. This really makes sense. We plotted him in there. And it just turned out that he had a companion named Li Shuzong, who was from China. And we're like, well, we can slot base a character off this. And I think that's where we started from, Patrick. And I mentioned in our essay on it that that's where we started from. But at this point, I feel like that character, of all the characters in the book, is really the one that took on their own life and just became their own thing with their own personality that got away from me, and is maybe one of the most strongest, interesting characters in the book.
Well, part of that, I think, part of where that vocalness comes from is the inclusion of additional poetry from Peter Keene, right? You've cast that character as like an aspiring poet, even though their whole life has been working in a factory, building bombs, and fighting. And the poetry you've brought in is some of Peter Keene's, and so Keene's sensibility ends up in that character, which includes a certain level of moroseness, a certain level of bitterness, but also just like a very romantic, poetic spirit. So it's both things kind of live there, right? Like somebody who is
a little gothy. I would say it's a little gothy.
Yeah, a little moody. But both things live in that character where they're so disillusioned with the way the world is, and they're shocked to find out that it could be a different way, which is another theme throughout the book, that the world doesn't have to be this way, that it became this way, and that it could be something else. And I think that character in particular like speaks to that desire and that need of rebuilding the world.
So we are getting to the 3 hour and 50-minute mark of this interview. So I want to sort of segue to looking forward, like where we are now and looking forward. And one of the things that's always interested me about you is that you're not just a comic artist. You actually teach this to other people. And I remember that actually through the course of building this book, you went through kind of like, this was kind of a side thing to you, and now it's kind of your main thing is teaching students. And so can you tell me how working on a comic like this has changed how you interact with young comic artists and students?
It's really, really, for one thing, it adds a little bit of validity to the stuff that you say, because it's easy to get in class and be like, do this. And they're like, who are you? Who are you to tell me to do this? And like nobody's that challenging. But when you ask people to push outside of their comfort zone and try things they've never tried before, and you can say like, hey, I know you need to clean up your thumbnails because I had an editor, and if my editor couldn't read my thumbnails, then we had nothing to talk about, right? Like then there was no editing to be done. Your layouts need to actually have text on them, and they need to, like, your text needs to be integrated into this. And so it adds a little bit of like, authority or legitimacy to it, but it really deepens the well of what you can bring to the table as far as helping students develop their own voices and giving them the tools that they're going to need to be successful. Comics, especially as an industry, has changed radically in the past 20 years, and even radically in the past 10 years, and again here in the past 5 years. We just keep finding new things to make the industry different. So while we can teach traditional, and we do, and we should, because those foundational tools are still so useful, being able to look at the industry as it is now, and from the inside, not just from like an academic perspective, like actually in it, that really, really has helped develop curriculum and coursework that's just more useful. The worst thing you can do for a student is tell them stuff they can't use. It sucks so much to graduate and find out that all the information you have is like 5 years old or 10 years old, and then none of it applies anymore. So having this experience has really allowed me to update my approach, not just my personal practice, but also like how I teach, what I teach, and what it is the students can get out of the experience. And I love teaching. So I just want to be a better teacher. So this was really great. Every step of the way, I learned something new that I can bring into the classroom.
So Patrick, where do you hope this project will take your career next?
I love drawing, and this is really, I want to keep doing that. I'm working on a couple book pitches with some other writers, some in the realm of history, like this book was, some totally not. Nothing that you can put a name on, but maybe sometime soon. But I'd love to be able to keep doing this. I mean, in my wildest dreams when I was a kid and comics were a thing you collected, not a thing you did, the idea of having a published book with my name on it was way outside of what I could ever have imagined. Just so far outside. And now, I mean, I can see it. It's a hardcover book. It's right over there, and it has our names on it. I mean, that's pretty phenomenal. And you know what? I'd like to do it again. I'd like to do it again. Nothing's guaranteed. Some people do one book and they never do another one. But I think that's where I'd like to go next. I want to keep working. I want to try different techniques and different genres and just see how far we can get. I'd love to keep telling stories.
So you keep telling me though that you're really into middle grade comics, and I don't know how, like, we haven't yet convinced you that you're more of that we could aim for like some Drawn and Quarterly kind of stuff, some really dark adult stuff. I mean, you're still on the middle grade stuff. We're gonna still try to find a path for you to that.
Yeah, I would love to do middle grade stuff. I have two personal, because like the projects I've been working on, I'm the artist and there's a writer, and I have two personal projects where I've written them and I've plotted them, and they're not ready to pitch yet. But they're in the middle grade realm because I love that work. I love that work. Jeff Smith's Bone, foundational for me. Vera Brosgol, I mentioned, who's a cartoonist I love, has a lot of really great like middle grade and YA work. Something about the cleanliness of that ink line. It's a thing I can't actually do, but it's a world I want to go live in and be like, here, take my messy stuff, like what can we do in it? This will be really fun. So yeah, that's definitely someplace I'd like to orient back towards at some point. So hopefully we'll get there. Dave, before we started working on this comic, you had written a radio play. Am I correct about that? Are you going to keep doing fiction work? Are you going to keep doing creative work?
Well, I mean, to be honest, like if I could just toss my career and just write audio dramas all the time, I would do that. I don't think that's a career for anybody on the planet except for maybe like Dirk Maggs is able to pull that off. And I met him at Comic-Con once, by the way. A very nice guy who responds to email. He says great, but he is pretty much a unicorn in that world. And I did write a short story that the La Jolla Playhouse turned into a Halloween audio drama once, and so that was really quite nice. So here's the thing. So I do want to work on fiction. I do have projects in my head, but I also have like the best day job I could ever imagine having at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. People don't know I get to work with like Cory Doctorow every day because he also, despite having this amazing career, also wants to work at EFF. He doesn't have to, but he wants to. That's how good a place it is. But I used to have time to work on a lot of stuff. But during the course of this project, something happened in my life. I had a child. She is 2. And if you have a 2-year-old child, you know probably how hard it is to have a second child that is a book. Especially this one that, this graphic novel, we started working on it in earnest in 2019. It is 2023 now. It will not be out till 2024. And because it's out in January 2024, that means we are probably going into 2025 before we even have to like worry about like, awards campaigns and stuff like that. So this is still going to take a significant chunk out of my life for a while to come. And so while I've got these things fermenting in my brain, every time I sit down to like I'm going to put down some words today, it's like, hey, like, Dynamic Duos wants to do a podcast with you. Can you and Patrick write up a bunch of questions for yourself? And I'm like, okay, creative project. I'm going to do that. And I'm going to attempt to write these questions while I've got a 2-year-old who wants me to play kitchen with her, or whatever other 2-year-old game. So I think in the future you will see more come from me. But considering that this project ends up being like a 7-year project, it's hard for me to commit to another 7-year project quite yet. But I have my my thought on when that kid turns 5, then I can start picking up like other things, and I can start planning for trips to Disneyland and Universal Studios, which is the whole point of having a child in the first place. Right? Right.
Oh my goodness. Well, Sam, do you have any other questions that what are any other avenues that we didn't hit?
I mean, you guys hit the broad strokes pretty well. I mean, the inspirations, the first meeting, the doing the research, touching on the humor was something I really wanted to talk about. So I was glad that you brought that up. Um, you know, when we were going over stuff, a lot of the notes, there was a lot of overlap. I was just trying to. Yeah, I'm the host with the ghost host with the most, to kind of quote the Haunted Mansion. So, so yeah, I mean, we've hit all the if there's again, readers and listeners can check this book out on January 23rd in comic book shops, or in bookstores, and on January 24th in comic shops. It's published through Dark Horse Comics and Berger Books, and yeah, I mean, Karen Berger is a legend in this industry, and like you were saying, really did revolutionize, I think, how the North American market sees the entire medium. So to get the instant green light from her is a huge vote of confidence. And yeah, I mean, I think when people think about Holocaust literature, they think, you guys mentioned Maass, and of course, Schindler's List being like just so dominant, such a dominant film. But there really is it really is a fantasy story with a sly sense of almost a defiant sense of humor in the face of death. And yeah, I think people are going to check it out. So yeah, again, check it out in the new year. Catch it at the end of January. Guys, this has been another installment of Dynamic Duos at CBR. I'm Sam. Thanks for taking the time to sit down and talk with me this afternoon.
Oh, thank you for having us. I really loved being here. This was super fun.
This is great. I would just sort of end that, I think we live in very difficult times and people are very confused and unsure. And I hope that maybe this book might provide a way to help process things and think about things and realize that through art and comics and literature, that we can find ways to understand the world and also cope with it, and then, if necessary, resist.